their time is done. It's over. I'm sick and tired of hearing about what a great hockey team the Soviets have. Screw them. This is your time. Now go out there and take it.
Welcome back, young scholars. This is the second video on the Cold War. The big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video are: first, in what different ways was the Cold War expressed? And second, what explains the rapid collapse of communism? The first big question, in what different ways was the Cold War expressed, is a carryover from the first video on the Cold War. In the first video, we talked about how Europe was divided up into two major blocks. You had the Western bloc following the principles of capitalism, and the Soviet bloc, or the communist bloc, in Eastern Europe. We also talked about how the Cold War led to the formation of some major international alliances, like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and the Warsaw Pact. As many countries also emerged from independence and colonial status, it led to the beginnings of a non-aligned movement, or a group of countries who were attempting to maintain neutrality in the Cold War. And then finally, it was expressed through a series of proxy wars. We talked about the very first of those proxy wars, the Korean War, and how the Korean War ended in the formation of the modern-day countries of communist North Korea and the more democratic South Korea. Today, we're going to look at a fourth way in which the Cold War was expressed, which is the Vietnam War. Now, in some ways, the Vietnam War represents this period of the latter half of the 20th century. It touches upon the Cold War, it touches upon decolonization and the fight for independence, which is really what this section of the course is mainly about. Last time we were in Southeast Asia, we saw how European countries had come in to colonize, and that would have included the French in Indochina. So from the 1880s until World War II, Vietnam, which was part of Indochina, was controlled by the French. In the 1940s, Japan invaded Indochina in the run-up to World War II, and then controlled Indochina as part of that Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity League that the Japanese were establishing across the Pacific. When Japan was defeated in World War II, the French then came back in. There was a leader in Vietnam named Ho Chi Minh. He was advocating for Vietnamese independence. He wanted Vietnam to no longer be under the control of foreign influences, like the French, like the Japanese. After World War II, Ho Chi Minh is going to declare independence. The war is over, Japan is defeated, so now Ho Chi Minh is going to assert that the Vietnamese people should be self-governing. They create a flag, there it is. They write a Declaration of Independence. See if you recognize this. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Ah, do you see what he did there? He just lifted directly the most famous part of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. There's another section of the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence which states this: all men are born free and with equal rights, and must always remain free and have equal rights. Remember that? That's from the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, that document that was produced during the French Revolution. But see what he does with it here. Nevertheless, for more than 80 years, the French imperialists, abusing the standard of liberty, equality, and fraternity, have violated our fatherland and oppressed our fellow citizens. So what Ho Chi Minh is pointing out there to the French is hypocrisy. You fought in this revolution asserting liberty, equality, fraternity, stating that all people are born with equal rights, but it so happens to be that the subjects of France in Indochina don't feel free and don't feel like they have equal rights as citizens of the French Empire. So after World War II, the French want Indochina back. They send the military back in to try and reassert control over Indochina. Ho Chi Minh then leads a guerrilla war against the French. This is known as the First Indochina War. And how guerrilla war works is it's not your traditional warfare where you have armies on the battlefield. Instead, you have individuals who appear to just be sort of average, everyday civilians going about their daily lives, who then engage in a series of surprise attacks on military targets. In this case, it would be the French military. Who is the United States going to back in this First Indochina War? it would make sense, right, that we would back this emerging group of nationalists in Vietnam. They're comparing their struggle for independence to our struggle for independence. But it turns out we are going to side with the French. And the reason for that is, if you look at the color of this flag, right, there's a lot of red in it. And that's because Ho Chi Minh and the nationalists that were leading this attempt at independence were advocates of socialism and communism. The US president at the time, Harry Truman, is going to side with the French. And the real reason for this is the fear of the domino theory, right? The idea that if Vietnam goes to communism, that other countries in Southeast and South Asia, like Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, and Bangladesh, would also likely move in that direction. This all comes back to that goal of containment. In 1954, the French pull their troops out of North Vietnam. And in South Vietnam, the French still have some remaining control through their military. At this point, Vietnam is divided at the 17th parallel. So there's a conference that's called in Switzerland to discuss the situation in Vietnam. The decision is made that, all right, we'll split Vietnam at the 17th parallel, but that there would be a national election to be held after 2 years. The idea being that Vietnamese people would eventually be reunified and that they would determine for themselves what kind of government they want to establish. So there were two major candidates to become the leader of this newly emerging country called Vietnam. And that was Ho Chi Minh and a guy named Ngo Dien Diem. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the Vietnamese Communist Party. And Dien Diem was supported by the United States. So the United States wants to install a friendly government, meaning an anti-communist government in Vietnam. And so they prop up this individual. Ngo Dien Diem didn't have as much support among the Vietnamese people. One of the maybe reasons was he was Christian, and in Vietnam, most of the people are Buddhist. As the election drew near, it became very clear that Dien Diem was going to lose. And so what Dien Diem did was he blocked the national election. So he says, no, we're not going to have this election anymore. I'm going to maintain control in the South, and the North can essentially do whatever they want. Dien Diem declares himself president in the South, despite the fact that there was never an election. Conflict and tensions just continue to escalate as the United States begins to send not just more and more money, but more and more troops into South Vietnam to try and continue to prop up that government of South Vietnam and ensure that communist forces didn't take control. In 1973, after a long, bloody war, a ceasefire agreement was reached between the Vietnamese people and the United States. In 1975, North Vietnam, in spite of their promises not to do so, attacks South Vietnam once the United States pulled most of their troops out, and it united Vietnam as one communist nation. And Vietnam to this day is still a communist nation. The only political party in Vietnam is the Communist Party of Vietnam. They've moved more in that direction of sort of the Chinese model, which is that they still only have one political party, and yet they've begun to adopt more free market economic policies, with still, though, the stated goal of achieving a classless society through Marxism. Vietnam has one of the fastest growing economies in the world right now. A fifth way that the Cold War was expressed was through another proxy war. This one fought between the Soviets and some rebels in Afghanistan. So it's known as the Soviet-Afghan War. If you look at this map, right, it shows the extent of the Soviet Union. That's in dark red here. And the control that the Soviets were exerting over the communist bloc in Eastern Europe. And so you have to ask yourself, all right, if we're going to continue to spread socialism, communism, where is it going to go next? And the next logical place for it to go was down into the Middle East. A communist party took power in Afghanistan in 1978. But there was a lot of resistance to communism spreading to the Middle East, and this makes sense, right? The communists are pushing very radical agenda of reforms. They want land redistribution. They want greater rights for women, and this is going to turn off many of the more conservative, traditional Muslims of that particular region. They created a flag which looks very much like the other communist flag. I actually like this one the best. So you see both the agricultural sector represented by the grain of wheat, and then the gear representing industry. Shortly after the communist government took power, there was a lot of resistance, and so the Soviets sent their military in to Afghanistan to try and support and prop up this communist government. From 1979 until 1989, the Soviet army then had to fight against these more traditional Islamic opposition fighters. They're known as mujahideen, who wanted to establish a more traditional Islamic state in Afghanistan. This is going to put the United States certainly in a very difficult position, because who do you support? Do you support the Soviet Union and communist government? Do you support these rebels who are advocating for a more traditional Islamic state? Turns out they supported the rebels, and so the United States gave money and weapons to the mujahideen. At least one of the mujahideen turned out to be this guy. This is Osama bin Laden, who later is going to organize the attack of the United States in 9/11. When the United States went to war in Afghanistan against the Taliban, which was the more traditional Islamic political party controlling Afghanistan at the time, the United States military was being shot at by some of the weapons that they had provided to these mujahideen fighters in this Soviet-Afghan war. In 1989, the Soviets withdraw their military and the communist government collapses. So if you think about the history of Afghanistan for the last 40 years, they've been at war, both with the Soviets and the United States, for basically 30 of those 40 years. The sixth way the Cold War was expressed is through a nuclear arms race. The United States and the Soviet Union were fighting to build up their nuclear arsenal. This reached a peak during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we'll discuss on another video on Latin America. The nuclear weapons were never used, despite getting very, very close. One of the major explanations is mutually assured destruction, or MAD, that whoever shot first in a nuclear war would end up getting obliterated second. The Cold War is going to lead to increased spending on national defense, both by the Soviets, but especially by the United States. This is an infographic showing the existence of various nuclear weapons in the countries that possess them around the world. These blue bombs out here on the end, those are nuclear weapons possessed by the United States. The red ones here belong to Russia. You got the United Kingdom and France and China, Pakistan, India, Israel, and those are the countries that possess nuclear weapons today. And as you can tell, they're enough to destroy the world many, 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 many times over. The United States, in particular, engages in a significant amount of military defense spending. Although this chart is a little outdated, you can see the United States was spending approximately $610 billion a year on defense, which is more than the 7 next greatest countries spend on their defense combined. There's a term for this, the military-industrial complex, which is a reference to the fact that there's a lot of private companies in the United States, including companies like Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Raytheon, that build arms, that build weapons, that build planes, that build tanks. Those weapons are then sold to various countries by these private companies in the United States around the world. Some argue that this has only led to an increase in the seriousness of conflicts, both in the latter half of the 20th century and the first half of the 21st century. The second big question is, what explains the rapid collapse of communism, and how do we achieve an end of the Cold War around the year 1991? One possible explanation is most of these proxy wars were not really going well for the global superpowers, whether it was the United States in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, or the Soviets in Afghanistan. Some other possible explanations also then for why communism will fall in a very short period in the 1980s and 1990s. For one thing, communism had essentially marketed itself as a more evolved and progressive society, and yet when you looked at the countries that had adopted principles of socialism, communism, there was significant repression and abuse, whether it was in the Soviet Union with Stalin and the Great Purges, or in China, the Cultural Revolution, where you had those young Red Guards running around the cities, engaging in vigilante forms of violence. There was also a significant genocide committed by a communist regime in Cambodia. This regime is known as the Khmer Rouge, and the leader of this communist regime that came to power in Cambodia was named Pol Pot. He committed a genocide against 1.5 million Cambodians, people who were his political opponents. He would round up and have taken to what were known as the killing fields, where there was mass execution of these political opponents. And so communism's moral standing had been damaged by these authoritarian regimes who engaged in violent and repressive acts towards their people. By the 1970s, there was also economic issues. Communist economies were stagnant. There was especially long lines for consumer goods. While socialist countries maybe did an okay job nationalizing some of those areas of heavy industry, they had a harder time identifying what types of consumer goods to produce, how many of them should be produced, what the quality should be. Consumer goods are one of those areas where competition fuels innovation, and when you don't have that, oftentimes it leads people to be less than satisfied with their economic circumstances. In the 1970s, there was growing disagreement also between the two dominant communist countries, which was the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. And the United States, and specifically the President Richard Nixon, tried to really take advantage of that. Tried to figure out a way to drive a wedge between these two large global communist superpowers. And so in the 1970s, Nixon hoped to exploit that growing tension between the Soviets and the Chinese. He did this first by scheduling a meeting with Mao Zedong. So we see a relationship beginning to initially form between the United States and the Chinese government. And that, of course, is going to make the Soviets jealous. Well, this is an image showing the Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, meeting with Richard Nixon. And as you can see, the relationships are starting to kind of warm up. The US and the Soviets agree on a policy of détente. Détente is a French word. It means relaxation. So the tensions of the Cold War are beginning to kind of chill out a little bit. This is going to lead to treaty negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union over issues like nuclear arms control. A nuclear arms agreement was reached between the United States and the Soviet Union called SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. They began to come to common agreement on reducing the stockpiles of nuclear weapons that both countries possessed. In the 1980s, a new leader emerged in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. By that time, the Soviet Union was experiencing some significant problems. They were struggling fighting a proxy war in Afghanistan. Their economy was not growing. Mikhail Gorbachev proposed a series of reforms, and these policies were known as Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost was an attempt to create a more open society, a more free society. And then second, Perestroika was a restructuring. There was recognition that there were simply too many decisions that were having to be planned and executed at the central level. And so there was an attempt at restructuring the economy to allow for more decisions to be made by more local government planners. Despite these last-ditch attempts at reform, the horse was already out of the barn. And 1989 is a really critical year, and not just because Taylor Swift was born in that year. In that year, there was a revolution that broke out in Poland to overthrow the communist regime. Shortly thereafter, there was a revolution in the Czech Republic, and then in East Germany, and then in Yugoslavia, and Romania, and Lithuania, and Latvia and Estonia, and Hungary, and Bulgaria, and Albania. And so communist regimes in each of those countries in Eastern Europe were toppled in a very short period of time. So in 1989, many Eastern European communist nations staged nonviolent revolutions, leading to more democratic governments and market-based economies. In the past, we've talked about how revolutions are contagious. We saw a similar outbreak of revolutions in that period in the late 1700s and early 1800s with the American, French, Haitian, Latin American revolutions. We see something similar taking place with revolutions breaking out across Eastern Europe in that year, 1989. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, which had been this symbol of the Iron Curtain and the divisions between the communist and capitalist world, was torn down. Then in 1991, the Soviet Union also experienced a major revolution The USSR was then broken up into several independent republics that are arguably more democratic and more free. Certainly there's different degrees of. So one of the more interesting questions to think about now, since we're living in the legacy and the shadow of the Cold War, is it really over? And officially it comes to an end in 1991, and yet we still see tensions that sometimes bubble over between the United States and Russia. Most recently, in the 2016 election, it was determined that the Russian government was interfering in that election. You can also make a case that there is an ongoing tension and struggle between the two now existing global superpowers, the United States and China. How is war fought in the 21st century? Well, most of it is through cyber spying and cyber warfare. And in the course of your lifetime, I imagine this will be one of the more significant conflicts that will continue to emerge as we move through the 21st century. As a result of watching this video, you should be able to answer these two big questions. First, in what different ways was the Cold War expressed? And second, what explains the rapid collapse of communism? As always, thanks for watching.